people lose weight and feel better and sleep better and are better, they will refer your product to friends.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Isabelle Kenyon, founder and CEO of Calibrate. In this episode, we discuss the company's Metabolic Reset program, we explore the rapid growth of prescription weight loss drugs, plus we cover the ongoing debate over how to treat obesity. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by Jack Taylor, our exclusive PR partner. More than just PR, they're creative storytellers and brand builders who actually understand the health and wellness industry. Learn more and get in touch at jacktaylorpr.com. Hi, Isabelle. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to today's conversation. I think plenty to get into both about Calibrate and the broader kind of prescription weight loss, so obesity conversation that's happening right now. And maybe to kick things off, could you just introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on?
Thank you again for having me. Very excited to be here. I'm Isabelle Kenyon. I'm the founder and CEO of Calibrate. Calibrate is a metabolic health business on a mission to change the way the world treats weight. We mean it in two ways. One, to set a new standard of care in obesity treatment, and two, to change the way we think and talk about obesity.
And just for some additional context, maybe to this point, how long have you been around? How big is the company? However you would quantify it, and any other kind of metrics to give us a sense of where you are in that process.
Absolutely. The business launched in June of 2020, so it's about 2.5 years old as we sit here today. The business initially launched direct to consumer, which means that consumers pay the cost of the Calibrate service. The Calibrate service combines intensive lifestyle intervention, so behavior change principles, with coaching and medication. So the idea is that you deliver a comprehensive program to consumers. And in the direct to consumer model, the consumer pays the cost of the Calibrate program, their insurer pays the cost of the medication. And then about 6 months ago, we launched our enterprise business, which is really where we're excited about the future of the business and investing in now. And that is payers, employers, or health plans paying the cost of the Calibrate service in addition to the cost of the medication.
Yeah, I think it's, even at this point, considering the enterprise is more newly launched, what percentage is direct to consumer? What is enterprise? And I guess, what is your hope long term as it continues to roll out, how that percentage breaks out?
Over the next year, enterprise will become about 50-50 in the business. And from there, we think it grows much bigger than the direct-to-consumer business. It has much more scale. It increases access and equity in a much more powerful way. But also, we love the direct-to-consumer business. I always say it's real product market fit. When a consumer pays for something, they tell you when they want a refund and that they don't like what they paid for, and you get real deep product market feedback. And I think that's really powerful, in addition to having a real lab where you can test different care protocols, which is really important to us. We are not wedded to a single care protocol. We've always believed that the combination of medication and doctors with lifestyle intervention is what's going to work here. And so wanting to be able to iterate those lifestyle intervention protocols, those care protocols on both the clinical side and the behavior science side.
Yeah, for sure. And there's kind of a lot that goes into it. Even when you're talking about the explanation, we have metabolic health, we have reframing weight loss and obesity. We have this moving into who's paying for it, right? Is this insurance companies, is it employers?
It's a big market. I learned this week, Morgan Stanley put out a report this week that Wegovy, the Novo Nordisk anti-obesity GLP-1, will be run rating $9 to $11 billion of revenue in Q4 of this year, which means that in 2.5 years, it got to $10 billion of sales. For context, it took Humira close to 8 years, 10 years, I think, to get there. Humira is the largest drug ever. And so I think, the size of this market, the number of people who are impacted, the number of people who could be impacted is just wild. And so I think really figuring out a healthcare perspective that is sustainable has been at our core from the beginning. What does the total cost of care equation need to look like to be able to treat obesity at scale?
And I think you mentioned too, in terms of getting launched like almost 2 years ago, was a little ahead of the curve, right? There were obviously some companies that were doing this, but especially going direct to consumer and then expanding pretty rapidly. And now it seems like everywhere you turn, right? There's a conversation about the drug development, big pharma debating the, other companies kind of launching, whether it's spinning up a particular protocol or whole kind of focused, right, platforms dedicated to weight loss and GLP-1s. From your perspective, without kind of going one by one and saying, oh, this is how it's better or different, or however you think about it, what differentiates Calibrate as it relates to just the perspective on both the problem and then the solution in terms of how you're approaching it?
There are two unique pieces. So the first is that we have always set the clinical standard here. We have always said this is what it looks like to deliver clinical excellence. In all 50 states, for every single person who joins Calibrate, there's a video doctor's appointment. For every single person, we purpose built the clinical model to really address obesity from the root cause, which is by improving metabolic health. We believe that if you improve metabolic health, you reset the metabolic system in a way that helps people to sustain long-term weight loss. The name of the business, Calibrate, comes from that idea of recalibrating, resetting the metabolic system. Our first product's called the Metabolic Reset. We believe this through and through and have since before we ever launched the business. And so for us, that was about building a clinical care model that reflected that. And it is extraordinarily difficult. And my thesis on healthcare is that we are failing at chronic disease management because we don't know how to treat patients long term. And so what we do is what we can. It totally makes sense. Doctors don't have resources to do lifestyle intervention and behavior change. They don't get paid to do that. Doctors don't have enough time with patients. They don't get paid to take people off of medication. And so medications that were designed as interventions, medications like SSRIs, medications like GLP-1s, end up getting used long-term indefinitely. And we can't afford that. And we don't know what that does to clinical outcomes long term. And so at Calibrate, we always said, we're going to take a different clinical approach and we're going to go back to the basics. We're going to go back to the evidence, back to the research and say, these drugs need to be used as interventions until we know more about them. Will some people be on the drugs forever? Maybe. But we will not be able to figure that out until we learn what the real long-term effects are. The second thing that's always differentiated us is this idea that we want a sustainable model for obesity treatment. We want as many people as possible to be treated, but that means you need to find a sustainable total cost of care equation. And that does not mean that 50% of Americans, 1 in 2 American adults, get to go on a $1,000 a month drug, right? We would go bankrupt. I just calculated it out. The cost of that is $2.3 trillion a year. Do you know what we spend on drugs today? $350 billion a year. Okay, we cannot do it. We'd go bankrupt. And so what we have to do is figure out who are the right people to take the right medications for the right amount of time. And at Calibrate, we've worked on those two things consistently from the beginning and saying, this has to be time bound. This has to be outcomes based. And outcomes mean the total cost of care equation works.
Yeah, I think that's a potentially huge hurdle to clear, which is this idea that you're getting on the medication, going through whether it's the metabolic reset or the coaching, the intervention, and hopefully forming some type of healthier habits, right? While having kind of the tool, right, to help you do that in these types of injections and weight loss prescriptions. Under some models, the idea is that you're going to continue to be on it and you're going to need to be on it because some studies to this point at least have shown that if you get off of it and haven't, logically, right, if you haven't changed any of those habits, you're probably going to gain the weight back because you're just going right back to what you did before. So in this case with Calibrate, and to be clear, it's like your goal is to help people lose weight, establish those habits, and then get them off the medication. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And not every single person and not all at the same time, but the vast majority of people finding a care model that works long-term for them in terms of both health outcomes and cost. And I think that's really important. What you just said actually just resonated with me in a really special way for the first time, which is how crazy is it that there are people entering this market saying obesity is a disease, it's about biology, not willpower. That was our tagline when we launched the business 3 years ago, by the way. Seems to be everyone's tagline now. But they basically are then saying, and so I'm going to treat this thing and I'm going to put the consumer in charge of deciding how long they want to take the medication for. The consumer will just tell me how long they want to take the medication for. They'll sign up on my website and pay a monthly price and just decide how long they want to pay for it. That's totally crazy in a world where we're saying, hey, this isn't consumers' fault. This is about biology, not willpower, which is true, by the way. But it's about biology in a way where physiology is included. And the underlying physiology has so many different pieces that impact it. Your food, your sleep, your emotional health, your exercise. Anyone who's ever worn CGM knows that it's not as simple as when I eat pasta, my insulin spikes. It's as complicated as when I get really angry at someone and don't say anything, my blood sugar spikes. When I don't get enough sleep this weekend, my blood sugar spikes, right? And so it's a really complex system. And it's really important, I think, that we put the power back in the hands of doctors, back in the hands of the healthcare system to say, how should we treat different people? It's not on consumers to solve this themselves and figure out how long I talk to consumers all the time who say things like, I just want to take Wegovy for a few months and then I'll be better. And I'm like, that's awesome. And that might work for you, but a doctor needs to be your partner in that decision. There is no way that it's fair for our healthcare system to say to you, you get 3 months on this medication, you get 12 months on this medication, you get 6 months on this medication. That is how we solve problems today. We do prior auths and we say, this is how many months you get. And that will not work. It won't. And so we need better models. We need more sophisticated models. We need doctors who have the tools and resources to be able to monitor member progress, patient progress over time based on a variety of different changes that they do make to their life, to their behavior.
Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a second. But first, I wanted to tell you about our exclusive PR partner, Jack Taylor. Honestly, this one's a no-brainer. We've known the Jack Taylor team for years. They work with some of the most innovative health and wellness companies. We're talking Whoop, Athletic Greens, Hyperice, and many more. Jack Taylor has an extensive industry network, knows how to work with high-growth companies, and really invests in building long-term relationships. I know this firsthand because they're Fit Insider's PR agency, so I can confidently recommend them, and I do all the time. From startups to more established brands, they go beyond pushing product to help companies truly thrive. If you want to learn more, head to jacktaylorpr.com and tell them Fit Insider sent you. Now, back to the show. Yeah, I think that's really important and, not kind of driven home or articulated or a concern, I think, broadly across the industry, at least at this point. And I think there will be a reckoning that has to play out when it comes to, again, who's paying for this, how long are they on it, what are the implications, what happens when they come off of it, and so on. But one thing I wanted to kind of raise, we talk about this, and it's happening a lot more now where the belief has kind of shifted. Obesity is biological, it's not about willpower. And I think that is a kind of lightning rod when you get down into the debate. And it's something I personally go back and forth on as well, because if that were the case, if it were purely 100% biological genetic, then what was going on even 10, 20 years ago that the vast majority of the population almost, if all trends go like,
Obesity didn't exist. Yeah.
yeah,
It
50% of the
didn't exist
population.
100 years ago. Yeah.
But also it's having come from a background where, in my case, working in the gym hand in hand with people of every, demographic and life stage, seeing them put the effort in, knowing that they're making every effort from food to sleep to stress, and still not being able to lose a meaningful amount of weight or sustain it over a period of time. So it's very obvious that it's somewhere in the middle and there's
Like
lots of
most things
things.
today, it's nuanced. And
Sure.
it's not a fun soundbite of me saying it's not about willpower, or it is about willpower, or it is not about genetics, or it is about genetics, or it's not about your environment, or it is about your environment. It's a really complicated blend. And what's really powerful here is the research we're doing on the biome and the research we're doing to understand how our environment has changed our gut over time. When we talk about the metabolic system, we're broadly talking about the brain gut connection. We're talking about how do things like hunger hormones and satiety hormones and energy hormones make you feel, right? And how do those things get balanced, unbalanced, in whack, out of whack? And so I think what's really important to understand is that we have a good amount of research here, but this has always been a lightning rod, right? This has always been funded by all sorts of different players with all sorts of different interests. This always has a really different component than other parts of health because it has a visible component. People don't wake up in the morning thinking, I wonder how my A1C is doing this morning. I hate that my blood pressure is so high this morning. They do wake up in the morning saying, I wonder if I'm going to be in pain today. I hate that I'm so tired. Like those are things that people feel because of their weight. And so weight is a super interesting entrance point to all of health because it's something that people can see. And so it's inherently viral in a lot of ways, which is why you have diets and fads and trends that catch on like wildfire because people say, what'd you do? How'd you do it? And if people comment on it, no one's like, your A1C looks awesome. What'd you do? Right? Like it's just not how we think about it. But I think the best reference for me is if you go back to how we thought about diabetes 20 years ago. How did you think about diabetes when you were growing up? How did we talk about diabetes when you were growing up? We called it adult onset diabetes. We said things like, if people stopped drinking soda, we wouldn't have a problem. We said things like, this is within your control to reverse. And we said, we're not paying for it. This isn't a healthcare thing. And now, to fast forward 20 years, this is the largest category of healthcare outside of cancer. And we are paying for it for everyone. And we would never have that kind of conversation. And we call it type 2 diabetes, no questions asked. And so I think like the relationship between language and medicine and language and weight and language and overall health is really, really nuanced. And this idea that people are living with obesity or struggling with obesity or obese or have obesity is super loaded. And we feel strongly about it at Calibrate. I personally feel strongly about it, but there's not one right or wrong answer. And whether or not things as simple as does improving metabolic health treat obesity or does losing weight improve metabolic health are not known things. We don't have a conclusive scientific answer. And so what you see is doctors take different perspectives, and that's okay. And that's how we get different care models to different people. And I think ultimately the data that I really like to explore and to learn more about is what's changed in the last 50 years and the last 100 years. And what's wildly changed is our environment, right? And I always give the example, if you moved to Southeast Asia, where the air quality is terrible, and got asthma, no one would say lifestyle choice. If you move to America in 2023 and you get obesity, how is it possible that we say that's a willpower lifestyle choice thing when people work two jobs, they don't have time to work out. People are stressed, people aren't sleeping, the economic pressure is insane. People are unable to afford healthy food. People are unable to literally access healthy food because they live in food deserts. Like, how is it possible that we say that's a willpower issue? Right? Like that's a systemic issue. And this has been really controversial, especially with the pediatric obesity guidelines in the last month or so. But like unpacking it in a nuanced way is really important and saying, listen, at the end of the day, does it come down to genetics? Does it come down to physiology? Does it come down to the environment? Sure. Answer D, all of the above.
Yeah, I think it's hard to parse through it and hold both of those ideas in your head. I know because
Cognitive dissonance is real.
I know because I personally struggle with it and try to reason through it and think about it, even to the extent of knowing food deserts, the vast majority of thinking about access to food, it's ultra processed, it's addictive, it's loaded with sugar, it's terrible for you, seed oils, everything that goes into that.
Seed
But
oils is
then
not conclusive, as an example.
what's that?
Seed oils are another controversial one where there's really compelling evidence in both directions. I don't know that they're necessarily good or bad. The fact that we're having this conversation that is so hard to get real nutrition information is you don't see this in any other part of science.
Yeah, I think even further down that path is the idea that do we need the nutrition science to know that seed oils are good or bad when if you just eat real natural foods, then it's almost impossible to do that and be obese. Like it's almost impossible to eat lean proteins, healthy fats, fruits and vegetables. And even if you're not exercising, which exercise complicates things actually because you burn more calories, then you're more hungry, then you eat more. And it's not necessarily shown that that's the best intervention also to lose weight. But if you did those things, how is it possible to eat enough from a fibers, being full perspective to gain weight? So it almost doesn't check out that I don't know that the research is going to give us the answer. In some ways I worry like we already know the answer, and whether it's supplements or whether it's fitness programs or whether it's digital health intervention, that risks moving us further away from like the basics, which were, did we not already know the answer to this for the previous X number of years that kind of got us to this place?
I agree and I disagree because it's all nuanced. I think that to me, I've always called this the world is flat argument. This is how we ended up thinking that calories were the whole story for decades because they made so much sense. It was so easy to say there's a caloric intake and there's a caloric outtake. And if those two things are out of balance, you gain weight. turns out like if that caloric intake happens from avocados versus that caloric intake happening from Doritos, there's a pretty different effect. And and so are natural foods good for you? Yes. Like we believe strongly at Calibrate that there are foods that are helpful for you and there are foods that are harmful for you in terms of your metabolic health specifically. And in terms of longevity, we worked on that food philosophy with a cardiologist. We believe that it is about like creating longevity, and that's what's really important. But will we constantly learn new things and will we constantly learn how different people are impacted? Yes. And are there people who can eat the perfect, healthy, real food diet and not lose weight? Yes. And like, is that because of their genetics, because of their environment, because of damage that's been done to their biome that's irreversible? All possibilities. And I think we live in a world that's so multifactorial that it's hard to say that that last statement you made that this is all a distraction from the basics is actually true. I think we're going to need more personalized approaches. We're going to need more specialized approaches. People don't live in clinical trials. I always talk about this. If you look at clinical trial data on GLP-1, you see one picture. If you look at real world evidence on GLP-1s as published by Calibrate, check out the website, you see a totally different picture. You see what happens when people lose access because they lose a job. You see what happens when people lose access because drugs go out of stock. You don't get the drug mailed to your house once a month like you do in the clinical trial. You don't get the person showing up with the scale and making you get on it, which they do in the $10 million budget clinical trial. You get someone who refuses to get on the scale for 8 weeks. So you don't have the data point. And so I think that's what's really interesting about the real world is people have got real things going on. We say life happens. It's true. People have grief, people have car accidents, trauma meaningfully impacts our metabolic health. And so there's all different pieces. And I think there is no one size fits all solution.
Yeah, it's even to the extent that assuming all those things were perfect, right? Environmentally and access and, life going your way, right? Which, you
Totally.
know, um,
If we like I always say this to investors, if we were all hanging out in your mountain house with a chef eating perfect food, yes,
for
that
sure.
might be a solution to obesity. That is not the solution to America's problem with obesity. And by the way, the rest of the world has super complex problems with obesity that look some similar to America and some very different.
Yeah, even and kind of where I was going with that was like, even if that were all true now and we were living in that mountain house, well, you know, going on again, if trends hold, like 50% of the population is going to be obese. So what do we do about the current state of affairs, knowing that the things that we have tried to implement aren't working and we're spending a disproportionate amount of healthcare dollars? Oh, by the way, not to mention all of the kind of trickle down effect into, other
The root
diseases
of
that are
all other cardiometabolic disease,
right.
half of cancer, lots of other chronic disease. It's
Yeah, and
crazy.
and that's where I think now we're kind of in this position where it's like for the people who need it most, where it is kind of critical to their health long term and broader societal implications, like there's obviously, even if you take that market alone, having this as a tool is beneficial. And one thing I've heard you talk about before, actually, and maybe you could break it down for us, is there's this typically when it's written about or when people talk about it, it's like this is not covered by insurance and there's no approval and therefore people who need it aren't going to get it. But I think I've heard you kind of talk about, well, it is approved and we are able to get people approved and here's how. So could you maybe clarify that piece, like what is covered, what isn't, and like how are you able to do
There's two
that?
different types of GLP-1s for those who are getting up the curve here. The first are GLP-1s that are FDA approved for diabetes. The second are GLP-1s that are FDA approved for obesity. Worth noting that of the two GLP-1s FDA approved for obesity today, those are the same medications as the ones approved for diabetes, except that they are in different doses from the same manufacturers made in the same places. And so I think what's really important to understand is that insurance companies aren't regulated by the FDA. They can do whatever they want. And so what they are supposed to do is say, where do I see the value? Where do I see the return? What population needs to accomplish what from a medication, from any treatment for me to agree to pay for it, right? That's their stated objective. And they've taken on lots of new business models since that original stated objective, right? But what they do is say, who should get access to GLP-1s that are FDA approved for diabetes, who should get access to GLP-1s that are FDA approved for obesity. And then the pipes do their job, or maybe the pipes don't do their job. The pipes are what happens when you go to the pharmacy and a claim runs. Who How does your insurance company decide in that moment whether or not they're paying for things? Sometimes they use your claims history. Sometimes they ask your doctor for more information. Sometimes they just approve or reject it based on what is or is not on their formulary. And so all of those things add up to basically saying that when you look at the US population on the whole, we think something like 90% of commercially insured lives have access to a GLP-1. It's something you can really only learn by running lots of claims for lots of patients. There's not a transparent way to go look up that stat. It's shifted over time. It's gotten higher over time. It may get lower as insurance companies try to figure out, wait, like what's the right amount of people and what's the right amount of time and what are the right medications. But I think ultimately, because GLP-1s are so widely regarded as standard of care in type 2 diabetes treatment, they are relatively easy to access for people with commercial insurance in the US.
Yeah, I think down that path too, and maybe a couple more questions as we get towards the end of the conversation. The idea of then, well, I guess it's different, right? In your case, thinking about the direct to consumer model versus the enterprise model and how then you're kind of acquiring customers through that. It seems like right now, probably more demand. So of course, you're focused on how do we continue to grow this and what do the metrics look like and how are we acquiring customers. But again, quite a bit of interest from the consumer perspective, people probably seeking you out and finding Calibrate. But how do you think about whether it's for you in the company and across this broader category, like marketing these types of solutions, prescriptions? How then there's quite a lot of controversy around it now from like TikTok ads, Facebook ads, who sees them, how easy it is to get access. You already mentioned like having to check in with a doctor. So potentially checking that box there. But is that a concern? And how do you balance that? Also knowing like we have to grow the business. We are going to acquire consumers. We are going to market this product, I guess, delicately, right? As you do that.
These are all of the most important questions of our time. I believe, and I have said this repeatedly, that metabolic health and who we treat and how long we treat them and how we treat them is going to be the question of the next decade. I think that we are going to iterate quite a bit. I think we are going to see a lot of different waves of treatment models available. And I think ultimately we're going to land in the right place. And I think ultimately we're going to say the right people need to get access to the right medications for the right amount of time, which means that we're wrapping around those medications with the right tools. And so for me, I think that there is no right or wrong answer to those questions. There is no like, this model is not okay, this model is okay. We believe that we differentiate in two ways. One is by having the most rigorous clinical approach. We stick with the FDA labels for who should be treated for obesity treatment. We don't treat people with lower BMIs. We understand that other people feel differently and doctors can do what doctors want to do. But that's for us a clear line in the sand. It has been since we launched. And we've actually made the criteria for participating much narrower than the FDA labels over time as we've learned who responds to who doesn't and who is right for a digital program and a digital intervention, right? There are people and populations that don't work well in this program. And so we're not going to put them into the funnel. And that's important for us. On the second side, and like, how do you square this with your business? This has been my refrain with the team since day one. If the product works, the business works. These are viral categories. If people lose weight and feel better and sleep better and are better, they will refer your product to friends. And for us, that has become wildly powerful over the 2.5 years in the business. They will refer your product to their employer. They will refer your product to their health plan. They work at health plans. They work in benefits teams, right? Like we have learned over and over again, doctors and nurses are two of the top 5 professions of our members. These are healthcare professionals who are looking for the wraparound solution, right? They could go get just the prescription. They don't want just the prescription. There's different people, there are different things, but ultimately, the way to square growth with clinical quality is always to put clinical quality first. If you build a product that works and that is safe and effective, you win. And you don't have to solve for Facebook ads or TikTok ads or whatever else.
Yeah, I think if it works, everything else kind of takes care of itself in terms of driving that flywheel. Along those lines and related to, you mentioned putting kind of like the clinical validation first and sticking to that, adhering to it, and there being this intervention that you potentially for some people they come off the medication. Can you talk a little bit about like what that entails from, I don't know if it's a coaching content, I'm sure some combination of both, because I think it's especially true in the digital health space. Like there's this idea of leveraging technology to increase access to expertise, right? And having a human in the loop and this accountability. But I think there's quite a few examples, right, where you have and companies are scaling these coaches and they're scaling the kind of lifestyle intervention, and it's not sustainable ultimately. So I wonder how you have done that to this point, and kind of what that looks like going forward.
For us, and I touched on this a tiny bit in the beginning when I talked about viewing the direct to consumer business as the place where we get to test and learn. That has been really important to me from the beginning, which is that's vertical. That's your doctors, your coaches, your program, your relationship with the consumer. To really get scale and to really create equity in healthcare, you have to go horizontal. And you have to say, here's Calibrate's research on a clinical model that worked for a population that looked like X. And then you have to say, so let's apply that to every patient of this health system where the doctors are still the doctors and the Calibrate program is the wraparound. And let's do that in partnership with this government plan, or let's do this in partnership with this community organization that is doing group coaching or group events or group engagement in a way that swaps out the coaches. Like you cannot one to one. I mean, again, let's play the numbers out. 50% of Americans need a coach. Like, let me tell you what that looks like. It's not going to happen. And so I think ultimately that's been our motivator: is how do you create scalable, sustainable models of care, and how do you publish on that? How do you share those results? How do you change the way the world treats weight? The mission of the business.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think it's also super valuable insight for other folks building in this space and thinking about, oh, what does this look like at scale? And assuming that it does work, what's the level of kind of human intervention that you're able to scale and make effective? One more before we wrap up, just this idea of, again, I feel like a therapy session for me in some ways is I'm like thinking through the various conflicts I've had in my head around this category. How do you think about the environment piece, right? Like changing what we're able to change, but also we're not ultimately addressing the root cause, which is some of these things which are much bigger, right? Like that seem like they should be societal, governmental, like policy changes where
You know, though, there's a word for this: obesogenic. We live in
right.
an obesogenic environment, right?
Right. And
We
so treating it right
yeah.
with Calibrate versus, hey, how do we undo the obesogenic environment such that maybe we wouldn't need this? Sorry to put you out of business in that way, but
No,
you
no.
know, the
This is to me, this is how you do it. To me, you change policy, you change perception by delivering results and outcomes. And by proving that those results and outcomes scale. By proving that you can do the same thing for nighttime shift workers that you can do for people who sit at desks and work 9 to 5. And I think proving that people who speak different languages, who come from different cultures, who have different philosophies around food, who have different relationships with food, who have different relationships with exercise, with emotional health, like you have to be able to solve for lots of different things over time. And you have to prove that the model works time and time again. And so I believe that you start with the smallest circle and you move out concentric circles as you start to demonstrate and prove that. And so the employees, for example, in our first employer businesses look a lot like the direct to consumer customers. And as we start to scale out, we'll get to different and different populations. And we're getting there quickly. But the idea is like you got to prove you can work on a population, you can work on a bigger population, you can work on a bigger population, and more diverse and different populations over time. And I think to me, that is how you treat, that is how you make policy change. That is how you make, like, there's so many ways to be disappointed in where we are, right? As a culture, as a society, there's so many things to look at and say, I saw stats on kids foods, kids lunches, and the sugar content this morning when I was reading the news. If you look at it and you have no context, you're like, that's appalling. Like, we live in one of the most successful countries in the history of time, and we can't figure out how to get healthy food to kids at school. But if you look at it in the context of where we were 10 years ago, you're like, looks pretty good. Like, that's real progress. And so I think the more science based, the more evidence based, the more results, the more outcomes you have for the more different types of people, the more people listen and the more things change. And I think you got to be an optimist to be a founder. So that's my perspective. But
yeah, I feel like whenever it comes up in conversations on the show, that's where I always get to, which is like default to optimism, and the hope is all the above. We have to do all these things, which ultimately then I'm sure puts you in the seat that you're in as the founder and CEO. The same reason that we're doing what we're doing here is like, we just have to keep fighting the good fight, to keep talking to people who are doing this, to advance, the idea that, look, whatever we're doing from a health perspective, healthcare access to, whether it's healthy foods or physical activity or time in nature, like, we're failing and we need to improve that. And so all the above, any which way, in that kind of default to optimism.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the
in
mission. You got to change the way the world treats weight, right? You got to change the way we think about it, we talk about it, we address it, we pay for it, the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. In doing that and continuing on, we covered a lot of ground here, but looking ahead, is there anything that you're excited about, we should look out for, or just generally keep up with as you continue towards that mission?
The watchouts are just how quickly this story changes. I don't know how much time will elapse between us recording this podcast and it going live, but I can guarantee you there will be at least one more TikTok cycle in between now and then of a totally different thing people care about with these drugs. Over the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks since Thanksgiving, however long it's been, 12 weeks, I guess, there has been cycle after cycle after cycle of story, personal story, UGC that goes viral rather, and that sets the tone. And that's what reporters want to talk about for the next couple of weeks. And that's the questions consumers want answered for the next couple of weeks. And so, the story changes really quickly. And I would say, watch out for the fact that this is, to me, the most differentiated drug launch ever. To me, think about the vaccine. 70% of Americans wanted the vaccine yesterday. And we had Herculean efforts to deliver it. These are drugs that overnight 50% of Americans want. We don't know how we could possibly manufacture them that fast. We definitely can't pay for them. We covered that already exhaustively, and we don't really know how to deliver them. We don't know what types of doctors should be delivering them. We don't know what care models should wrap around them. And so I think we're going to see things like you've never seen consumer interest in medication like this before. And I think it's going to really fundamentally shift how it rolls out into a very, very fast iteration cycles.
Yeah. And also the implications related to, is that a good thing or a bad thing that 50% of people want them or need them, and how you manage
It
that?
is just a different problem. Like the playbook that pharma companies use is I hire X sales reps to go into Y doctors' offices, and then X times Y prescribes 10% of their population who's eligible these medications. So I know that I'll have Z prescriptions next week. That playbook doesn't work if consumers are like, I want it now. And doctors are like, the data looks safe. My patients could benefit from losing weight. Like, let's see what happens. Let's see how they work. Let's see if they have side effects. Let's see if they have long-term effects. And that is just a totally different problem to solve than we've had to solve before.
Yeah, I think it sounds like at least we'll get this turned around, and then I'll have to hit you back up for a round two and follow-ups, and see where we are later
Let's
on
talk
this year.
when GLP-1 sales surpass Humira in a couple of months.
In the interim, where would you point folks that want to learn more about Calibrate?
Calibrate.com. We would love to have you learn more. And thanks so much for having me today, Joe.
Likewise, thanks for being here. One more thing before you head out. Help us spread the word. Take a minute to rate and review the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, or share this episode with a friend. And if you like conversations like this, you'll love the Fit Insider newsletter. We send it every Tuesday. The link is in the description. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you back here next week.